we're going to begin this morning as we prepare for the Lord's Supper by considering the cost of forgiveness. Luke 23, verses 33 and 34, says, "When they came to the place called the Skull, there they crucified Jesus and the criminals, one on the right and the other on the left. But Jesus was saying, 'Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing.' And they cast lots, dividing up his garments among themselves." Here Jesus is brought to a place so associated with death that it's called the skull. In Latin, it's the word Calvary. In Aramaic, it's called Golgotha. We aren't 100% sure why it's called the place of the skull. Some people believe it's because the hill actually resembled a skull. Others suggest that so many people were put to death there, it just kind of got that nickname over time. But the point is, in that day, if you were being brought to the place called the skull, you knew exactly what was about to happen. And sure enough, Luke says, there they crucified him and two others with him. Yet despite being in a place of death, Jesus prays for the spiritual life of those who brought him there. He prays that God would forgive them because they have no idea what they're doing. And it's a little bit of a strange statement to make. Not just the forgiveness part, that's strange in and of itself, okay, but also saying that they don't know what they're doing. Because in many ways, they did know what they were doing. The Romans were crucifying him. They had crucified tens of thousands of people. They knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't an accident. And the Jews, especially the religious leaders, they knew that Jesus' trial was a sham and that they purposely hired false witnesses against him and that they're killing him here out of envy, not out of justice. So how could Jesus say they don't know what they're doing? Well, there are a lot of sins that they committed here with full knowledge. But what they did not know is that they were crucifying God's Son. Their hearts had been so blinded and hardened by sin that they could not see who they were actually putting to death. If they truly believed that this was the long-awaited Messiah, the Jews would have never called for his crucifixion. And according to the law of Moses, it is their ignorance that actually gives them the hope to be forgiven. Jesus is appealing to the law's teachings about unintentional sin. In Numbers chapter 15, it makes a distinction and says, if you sin unintentionally, you can be forgiven by a sacrifice from the priest. But if you sin intentionally, there is no sacrifice for you. You will be cut off from God and cut off from your people. Some people believe that means death. At the very least, you're socially ostracized from the community. And I'll tell you, for a long time, that law confused me. Because almost all sin, if you think about it, is intentional sin. It's pretty rare that we just accidentally give in to temptation. Usually the pattern is Satan tempts us to do evil. We know that it's wrong, but instead of obeying God, well, we do what we want and we listen to Satan and we give in to that temptation, making the intentional choice to do so. But I think the point of Numbers 15 is not so much to set up the difference between sinning accidentally versus choosing to sin. But rather, the difference is between stumbling in sin versus defiant, open rebellion against God. The Jews here, putting Jesus to death, are stumbling in sin. It's why Paul calls Jesus a stumbling block to the Jews, because he did not match their conception of the Messiah. So it's not like they knew for a fact that this was God's Son. We know this is the long-awaited Messiah, but we're going to openly, defiantly rebel against God and put him to death anyway. That's not really what happened. They genuinely thought Jesus was a blasphemer for claiming to be the Messiah and the Son of God. Now, of course, some people believed in him, okay, but those calling for his crucifixion, it's because they thought he was blaspheming. And since their sin was unintentional, according to the law, the priest can offer a sacrifice for their forgiveness. And something else that they did not know is that Jesus was their new high priest. and that he was the sacrifice for their forgiveness. So think about it this way. It means when Jesus prayed, "Father, forgive them," he knew in order for God to answer that prayer, it would cost him his life. Jesus shows us forgiveness is not cheap. And this morning, I want to explore what our forgiveness actually cost Jesus. Number one, it cost him the satisfaction of justice. Look with me in Psalm 58, please. Psalm 58. We've talked a lot this year in our daily Bible reading about how much satisfaction it gives the righteous when our wicked oppressors are brought to justice by God. For instance, this psalm, Psalm 58, is about God bringing down corrupt judges who are guilty of countless injustices against the innocent. And it says in verses 10 and 11, "The righteous will rejoice when he sees the vengeance from God. He will wash his feet in the blood of the wicked, and men will say, 'Surely there is a reward for the righteous. Surely there is a God who judges on earth.'" So, because we're made in God's image, it gives us great satisfaction. And it feels like a reward, the psalmist says, to see the bad guys brought to justice. It's why we love cop shows and we love superhero movies where good triumphs and the evildoers are punished. We celebrate, even in the news, when we see some dirtbag who committed some horrendous crime. He finally gets caught and he finally gets thrown in prison where he deserves to be. I read an article by Shane Scott, and he talked about a Jewish writing from between the Old and the New Testaments that was not inspired by God, but it's helpful in understanding key events from Jewish history. And the book was called Second Maccabees. You've probably heard of it before, but it recounts a series of executions that took place when the Greeks were putting Jews to death. And one of the Jewish men in Second Maccabees who was being executed said this as he was dying: "Keep on and see how God's mighty power will torture you and your descendants." So as he was dying, this man was calling God's justice down on his oppressors. And honestly, it sounds like he went even further with sort of a vindictive attitude toward his enemies. But that's our natural human inclination, to want the bad guys to get what they deserve. Yet, when Jesus was dying, he didn't say anything like that. He didn't say, "Father, please make them pay for this." Or, "Father, please make them regret the day they ever dared to defy me." You know, let's just be honest. Jesus, he was God, but he's also a human. So if God were to have just sent fire down from heaven immediately and just destroyed everybody that was crucifying him, there would be a part of Jesus that would take some satisfaction in that, because he's a human and we get satisfaction when the bad guys get what they deserve. But Jesus completely laid aside any satisfaction he might get in seeing justice done, and he offered them mercy instead. That's an extremely high cost to pay. But because of Jesus and the depth of his love, it was far more satisfying for the dirtbags to be forgiven than to get what was coming to them. And praise Jesus for that, because we are the dirtbags Jesus gave up the satisfaction of justice for and offered mercy to instead. Amen. Secondly, it cost him his control over us. Look in Matthew 18. Matthew 18. This was Jesus' parable about a slave with an unpayable debt to the king. And in Matthew 18, the slave says something very interesting. Matthew 18, verse 26. Verse 26, "So the slave fell to the ground and prostrated himself before him, saying, 'Have patience with me, and I will repay you everything.'" When someone is in debt to us because they wronged us, it gives us the upper hand in the relationship. It gives us a sense of power and control over them. almost like we are the master and they are our slaves, because they have to now scramble to make things right with us. And we can lord their mistakes over them, and we can determine whether what they've done to make things right is enough or not, or whether they still owe us. And this concept helped me realize another aspect of what Jesus said in John 15, in verse 15, when he says, "No longer do I call you slaves, for the slave does not know what his master is doing, but I have called you friends. For all things that I have heard from my Father I have made known to you." Now, in the immediate context of John 15 there, Jesus is talking about the closeness of his relationship. That's really his main point. But if you think about it, another difference between a slave and a friend is that a friend is not in your debt. Slaves often became slaves because they owed a debt that they could not pay. But for Jesus to call us friends, it means we don't owe him anything anymore. The debt was paid for us by Jesus on the cross so that we could be forgiven. And now we can just be friends with Jesus without the pressure of scrambling to try to make things right with him and God on our own. Now we're free to abide with him in love instead of having to work off our debt. But it was costly for Jesus to give up that control. Thirdly, it cost him emotional safety. And sometimes we struggle to forgive people because in doing so, we are inviting them back into our lives and therefore opening ourselves up to the risk of them hurting us again. It's much easier to just wall ourselves off emotionally and to tell this person, you know what, I'm done with you. You wronged me, we're done. No more relationship, I'm moving on without you, as sort of a defense mechanism to keep us safe. But Jesus was willing to completely forfeit his emotional safety in order to forgive us. His willingness to forgive made him completely vulnerable to being hurt. And that's exactly what happened. We hurt him physically by putting him on a cross. But we also hurt him emotionally by rejecting him when all he wanted to do was love us and to be reconciled in his relationship with us. It makes us understand in Isaiah 53:3 when it says he was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. And like one from whom men hide their face, he was despised and we did not esteem him. Jesus, he was willing to risk being despised and rejected. And he was even willing to be rejected after his sacrifice. It's one thing, it's hurtful enough for people to reject God and to reject his son before Jesus actually came and died on a cross for the sins of the world. But once he comes and dies for our sins, the rejection is even more painful because of what he went through. But Jesus was willing to pay the cost of extreme vulnerability to being hurt. Because to Jesus, our forgiveness was worth the cost. And the final point this morning is that it cost him his life. When Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper, he said about the wine in Matthew 26:28, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." Forgiveness cost Jesus his blood. Jesus showed us that forgiveness is an act of radical self-denial. It's a denial of one's natural desire for justice, one's natural desire for control over others, for emotional safety, for one's rights, and yes, even the most basic right to live. Jesus helps us understand why forgiveness isn't cheap, why it's so hard and painful. But he also shows us it's 100% worth the cost if it means our relationship can be restored. And so as we partake of the Lord's Supper this morning, I want us to consider, number one, what it cost Jesus to forgive us. Number two, that he loved us so much, he believed it was worth any cost in order to be reconciled. And then finally, to ask ourselves, am I willing to pay the cost to forgive the people in my life the way Jesus paid the cost to forgive me?